It was supposed to be a simple segment, just another morning on The View. Talk a little policy, debate some ideas, maybe spark a few laughs before cutting to commercial. But what no one expected, what no one was prepared for, was Rosie O'Donnell stepping on that stage with something far more calculated than commentary. She had an agenda, and it wasn't just to disagree, it was to diminish, to belittle. To remind a man who had spent decades navigating justice and conscience that, to her, he was still just an actor. What Rosie didn't know, what she still refuses to understand, is that Denzel Washington isn't the kind of man you challenge unless you've come prepared. He doesn't yell, he doesn't flinch, he doesn't grandstand, he waits, he listens, and then, when it matters, he speaks, not for applause, but for impact. And on that particular morning, Rosie O'Donnell walked into something far larger than a debate. She walked into a reckoning. The producers had billed it as a conversation on criminal justice reform, a rare moment of unity across party lines, with Denzel invited to share details of a new initiative he'd been quietly building for years. Not a celebrity cause, not a vanity project, but a fully developed policy proposal rooted in decades of on-the-ground work, visiting prisons, funding re-entry programs, meeting with legal scholars, and mentoring young men who had seen more concrete than classrooms. This wasn't PR, this was principle. Rosie had been briefed. She knew the segment was supposed to be serious. She also knew who was sitting across from her, but backstage, the mask had already slipped. One crew member overheard her scoff between makeup touch-ups, muttering under her breath, "Hollywood liberals think they're politicians now. I'll remind him he's an actor." That wasn't commentary, that was contempt. For years, Rosie O'Donnell had built a brand on being loud, unfiltered, confrontational. She de-sparred with Trump, clashed with co-hosts, and walked off The View not once, but twice, each time after emotional meltdowns broadcast to millions. And still she kept coming back, armed with opinion and attitude, rarely substance. Denzel, by contrast, had spent 3 decades doing the opposite: quiet visits to juvenile centers, anonymous donations to legal defense organizations, guest lectures at Ivy League institutions, not for cameras, but for conscience. He wasn't there to entertain, he was there to engage. The difference between them wasn't political. It was philosophical. Rosie brought volume, Denzel brought value, and on that morning, the contrast would be impossible to ignore. As the lights dimmed and the camera's red light clicked on, the audience buzzed with the usual anticipation. But something in the room felt different, not tense, not yet, but still, as if everyone instinctively sensed they were about to witness something beyond television, beyond banter, a cultural collision between celebrity ego and earned gravitas. Denzel sat still, hands folded, eyes focused, dressed simply, no flash, no pretense, just presence, the kind of presence that doesn't ask for attention, it commands it. He'd been invited to talk about his new legislation proposal, a draft criminal justice bill designed with experts from Harvard, Georgetown, and the Brennan Center, reviewed by state policymakers, supported by bipartisan coalitions. It wasn't theory, it was law in the making. And Rosie, she saw all of that and still decided to challenge it, not with counterpoints, not with facts, but with tone, with mockery, because to her, Denzel didn't belong at that table. He wasn't a senator, he wasn't a lawyer. He was a man who had played cops and crusaders on screen, sure, but now he had the audacity to speak like he understood the real thing. Rosie didn't come to disagree, she came to condescend. And what she didn't know, what she never saw coming, was that the man sitting across from her didn't need applause to win a room. He didn't need the last word to deliver the truth. He'd been raised by a Pentecostal preacher, taught that restraint is strength, that preparation is power. She came to perform, he came prepared. And that difference was about to become painfully, publicly clear. The conversation had barely begun when Rosie O'Donnell decided to flip the table. Denzel had just finished laying out the foundational concept of his proposed justice reform initiative: clear, articulate, methodical. No grandstanding, no political posturing, just the facts. How sentencing disparities cripple entire communities, how judicial bias doesn't just wound, it replicates, and how real reform doesn't start with hashtags or headlines, but with policy built from the ground up. He was mid-sentence, breaking down Section 1, which called for a mandatory review of state sentencing data across race and geography. Citing real-world cases, referencing peer-reviewed studies, you could hear the room leaning in. Even the co-hosts, who were used to playing ping-pong with talking points, had gone still. That's when it happened. Rosie shifted in her chair, rolled her eyes, and cut in loud, sharp, dismissive. Okay, sweetheart, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, maybe stick to movie scripts. This is a little more complex than Hollywood activism. The air snapped. It wasn't just a bad take. It was an open slap across the face of everything Denzel had built, not just his career, but his credibility, his values, his lived commitment to the very issue at hand. The audience froze. You could feel the tension tighten like a wire. 1 second earlier, they were listening. Now they were watching. Whoopi Goldberg, seated just a few chairs down, didn't say a word, but her expression said plenty. Her mouth drew into a firm line, her eyes narrowed. She looked at Rosie, then at Denzel, then back again. The shift was subtle, but it was unmistakable. It was the look of someone who had just watched a line being crossed. Joy Bihar's pen stilled in her hand. Even Sunny Hostin's posture stiffened. No one expected Rosie to be delicate, but no one expected her to go there either. What made the moment worse was how casual Rosie was about it. She didn't even blink. She leaned back in her chair, half smiling like she'd just said something cute. It wasn't cute. It was condescension layered with cultural dismissal. And worse, it was familiar. This wasn't the first time Rosie had tried to downplay Denzel's intellect. Back in 2016, during a podcast interview, she'd quipped that Denzel takes himself too seriously for a guy who plays cops for a living. She said it as a joke, but everyone listening knew it carried an edge. She did it again now, but this time in front of a live national audience. Rosie wasn't just interrupting, she was invalidating. And not just Denzel's argument, but his right to make one. That kind of remark doesn't come from disagreement. It comes from entitlement. The entitlement to decide who gets to speak seriously about serious things. And who should, in her view, stay in their Hollywood lane. Denzel didn't move, not at first. His hands remained folded, his posture unchanged, but his eyes, those eyes so often calm, suddenly sharpened. He blinked once, slowly, processing. Not the insult, he'd heard worse. No, he was processing the moment, the weight, the motive. He knew what this was, and so did the audience. A ripple moved through the studio, not outrage, not yet, but something colder, recognition. They had seen this scene before. A man of color, measured, credentialed, prepared, dismissed with a smile by someone who refused to see the depth behind the dignity. Rosie kept talking, because of course she did. I mean, I get it, you care. That's great, but real policy requires more than passion. It's complex, it's nuanced. It's not just about good intentions and speeches, it's about experience. You're new to this, right? I've been around politics for a long time. It wasn't just arrogant, it was historically tone-deaf. This was a man who had spent the last 30 years working quietly behind the scenes, visiting youth detention centers without media, funding legal clinics for underrepresented families, collaborating with public defenders and criminal justice scholars across the country. But Rosie reduced all of that to a Hollywood phase, as if his life's work could be dismissed with a wave of her hand. And still, Denzel did not interrupt. He let her keep talking. Because sometimes, letting someone keep talking is the most powerful thing you can do. She spoke over him. She spoke around him. And every time she tried to shrink his role, his silence made her words feel smaller, more transparent, more desperate. The audience could feel it. You could see it on their faces. What started as an awkward exchange was quickly becoming something else, something uglier, not a clash of opinions, but a clash of paradigms, of values, of entitlement versus earned insight. What made it worse, what made it sting, was that Rosie wasn't really listening. She wasn't debating the policy. She hadn't even addressed a single point in his proposal. She was debating his right to speak on it at all. That's not disagreement. That's erasure. And in that moment, whether she realized it or not, Rosie O'Donnell wasn't just insulting Denzel Washington. She was standing in for every voice that ever told a man like him, "You don't belong here." And that, more than anything she said, was what turned the studio cold. The words had landed like a slap, but Denzel didn't flinch. He didn't bristle, didn't raise his voice, didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he sat perfectly still. 3 full seconds passed, silent, charged, deliberate, long enough for everyone in the room to feel the shift. Long enough for Rosie to realize, maybe too late, that what she had just stepped into wasn't a debate. It was something far deeper, far more dangerous for her, a moral reckoning in real time. The camera cut in tighter, instinctively drawn to his stillness. Not the kind of stillness that comes from hesitation, but the kind that comes from calculation. This wasn't a man looking for the right words. This was a man choosing the most effective silence. Denzel's eyes didn't leave Rosie. They didn't dart around for support. They didn't flinch toward the co-hosts, or the audience, or the producers just off stage. He held her gaze with the calm of someone who had seen storms much worse than this and survived them all. Someone who didn't need to shout because truth, when fully formed, doesn't shout. It waits. In the quiet, time bent. The studio audience leaned in, instinctively, like spectators who know the punch is coming, not out of anger, but precision. And what made it more unnerving, more powerful, was that no one knew exactly when or how he would respond. They only knew that when he did, it would matter. Rosie, still holding her smug half-smile, began to shift in her chair. Not much, just a flicker, a subtle tightening of her mouth. Maybe it was nerves, maybe it was recognition. She had won the moment in volume, but lost it in weight, and she knew it. For Denzel, this wasn't new. He'd lived a life where silence often spoke louder than reaction. He remembered something his father had told him as a teenager after he got into an argument at school over a teacher who dismissed his opinion. Don't speak with emotion when you hold the truth. Let silence do the cutting. That line had stayed with him through Hollywood, through politics, through every panel and press junket where someone mistook his calm for complacency. And now it surfaced again, not as a memory but as a strategy. He breathed once, not a sigh, not frustration, just control. Across the table, Whoopi's expression hadn't changed, but her eyes had. She was watching Denzel the way someone watches a master craftsman reach for the final stroke. The others, Joy had gone rigid. Sunny Hostin sat perfectly upright, pen forgotten in hand, her gaze locked on him. Even the studio crew, used to chaos and unscripted drama, had gone still behind the cameras. Because everyone, from the control room to the back row, could feel what was about to happen. This wasn't rage. It wasn't defense. It was something colder, sharper, more permanent. Denzel's silence wasn't empty. It was weighted. It was letting the insult breathe just long enough to rot in the open air, letting everyone see it for what it really was, lazy, entitled, and built on nothing. Rosie didn't speak again. She couldn't, not because she wasn't allowed, but because somewhere in the space between her last sentence and this silence, the room had turned on her, not by voice, but by posture. The crowd wasn't angry. They were embarrassed for her. That was worse. And Denzel, he was just getting started. He didn't need to raise his voice. He only needed to open his mouth once. And when he finally did, the world would remember what it sounds like when a man speaks not from ego, but from earned authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean in. He didn't match her energy. He didn't need to. After the silence, after the weight of the room had collapsed inward like gravity around his stillness, Denzel finally spoke. And when he did, his voice was low, measured, almost soft, but it carried with the precision of a scalpel. "Well, Rosie," he said, pausing just long enough for the room to recalibrate, "I'm 70 years old. So if you've been doing this longer than me, you must have started in grade school." The audience let out a small ripple of laughter, not loud, not mocking, but relieved. A release valve, a reminder that poise could cut deeper than pride. Denzel didn't smirk, he didn't even smile. He just nodded once, as if to say, that was the last light jab. "Now let's talk." Rosie shifted, her mouth twitching with a response she never got to deliver. She began to raise her hand, but Denzel was already continuing, uninterrupted, unbothered. I didn't come here for a fight, he said. I came here for a conversation, but if you're going to question my qualifications, then let me help clarify them for you. And then layer by layer, point by point, he began to dismantle her entire premise. I graduated from Fordham University, he said, his voice steady, with a double major in drama and journalism. That's 2 degrees. Not honorary, earned. I went on to study at the American Conservatory Theatre, one of the top graduate-level training programs in the country. He didn't list them like achievements, he spoke them like facts, cold, clear, irrefutable. I've been invited to speak at Harvard, at Georgetown, at Yale, not to talk about fame, but about narrative, media, responsibility. And I didn't show up with sound bites. I showed up with research, with questions, with humility. Rosie blinked. She tried to smile again. It didn't land. The audience wasn't on her side anymore, and she could feel it. I've worked with incarcerated youth for more than 20 years, Denzel continued. Not for headlines. Not for optics. Quietly, week after week. Visiting centers, mentoring, funding re-entry initiatives, especially in underserved communities like the Bronx, where I was born. That landed because it was real. Because it wasn't charity, it was proximity. It was lived experience. I've sat with public defenders trying to keep teenagers out of adult courtrooms. I've met with families who lost sons to mandatory minimums. I've testified before state panels on sentencing disparity. You want to talk policy? I'm happy to. He looked directly at Rosie now, not with anger, but with clarity. But don't mistake my profession for my purpose. She opened her mouth, desperate for an opening. He didn't give it. Let me finish, he said simply. I've earned that. It wasn't a flex. It was a boundary. One built from 3 decades of being interrupted, underestimated, and pushed to the edges of conversations he was more than qualified to lead. And he wasn't done. You called this Hollywood activism, he said. But here's what that really means. I've used my platform, every film, every interview, every speaking opportunity, not to boost myself, but to lift voices that don't get heard. When I played Malcolm X, I didn't just study the role. I studied the movement. I visited mosques. I met with civil rights leaders, because if I was going to wear that legacy, I needed to understand it. The room was frozen now. Rosie wasn't just being corrected, she was being revealed. I've turned down roles that would have made me millions, Denzel said, because they glorified violence without context, because they mocked communities I came from, because I knew that every story I put on screen mattered more than the paycheck I got for telling it. And then calmly, but with unmistakable intent, he laid the foundation for the final pivot. So when you say, I don't have experience, or I don't understand complexity, what exactly are you basing that on? He let the question hang there, not rhetorical, not theatrical, just exposed. Is it because I'm not shouting? Is it because I'm not tweeting every hour? Or is it because I don't fit your idea of what a political voice should look like? Rosie didn't answer. She couldn't. The words she had thrown so easily minutes ago now lay in front of her like broken glass. Denzel adjusted in his seat, not a shift of discomfort, but of intention, a resetting of posture, as if to say, you wanted this conversation, now you'll get it. I've partnered with organizations like the Brennan Center for Justice, Equal Justice USA, the Vera Institute, he said. We've built programs that train formerly incarcerated individuals to become legal advocates, not because it looks good, because it works. His voice never rose, his pulse never changed. He was delivering facts like a lawyer in closing arguments. Calm, complete, unshakable. I didn't show up here to impress anyone. I showed up prepared. That's the difference. You could see it on the faces in the room, not just agreement. Respect, even awe. Because what they were witnessing wasn't a comeback. It was a confirmation. A man walking into a space where he wasn't expected to hold ground, and then building it beneath him with every word. Denzel looked at Rosie once more, eyes steady. I'm not here for applause, he said, but I do expect accuracy. And with that, he folded his hands again, leaned back slightly, and left the silence to speak for itself. There was a pause after Denzel finished speaking, not the kind that feels empty, the kind that feels earned. The kind of silence that hangs in the air because nothing else can follow it unless it's something stronger, something deeper, something built. And Denzel Washington had just spent 5 minutes laying the foundation. But he wasn't done, not even close. He leaned forward, calmly resting his elbows on the table, not to lean into the fight, but to anchor the room. To signal that now, the conversation was going to shift, from defense to definition, from rebuttal to rebuilding. You see, he began, voice steady, a lot of people talk about criminal justice reform like it's a slogan. Something you say when the cameras are rolling. Something you put in a tweet and forget by the end of the week. He glanced around the table, not challenging, just observing, measured. But real reform, he said, doesn't come from noise. It comes from structure, from policy, from commitment, and that's why I'm here. He reached to the folder in front of him, not a prop, not a gesture, but the real thing. He opened it, pulled out a printed packet, not flashy, just facts. This, he said, holding it up, is the Community Sentencing and Accountability Act of 2024. It's not a wish list. It's a working bill, one that's already been reviewed by legal scholars at Harvard, Georgetown, and the Brennan Center for Justice. One that's been submitted to 2 bipartisan coalitions in the House for markup. The audience did erupt. They didn't need to. The weight of what he was saying was clear. He wasn't here to prove he belonged. He was here to show he was leading. It's built around 3 core pillars, he continued. 3 things we can do right now that would make this system more just, more transparent, and more effective. His tone didn't change. It wasn't a speech. It was instruction. Like a professor walking his class through a syllabus that mattered. First, he said, mandatory review panels at the federal level. These panels would evaluate sentencing data across race, income, and geography. Because right now, 2 people can commit the same crime in different zip codes and receive drastically different sentences. That's not justice, that's roulette. The words didn't shout, they struck. Second, he said, federal funding for evidence-based rehabilitation programs. Programs that work, that reduce recidivism, that reconnect people to education, to employment, to community. We are talking about initiatives like the Bronx Reentry Collective, the ones that have proven results, yet remain underfunded while we pour billions into punitive systems that don't. He didn't just know the names, he knew the data, the outcomes, the faces behind the numbers. Third, he said, judicial accountability. Every judge in this country leaves a data trail, who they sentence, how they sentence, where the patterns lie. My bill would create independent review boards to identify bias, hold repeat offenders accountable, and ensure that equal protection under the law actually means what it says. He paused, not for drama, but for gravity. These aren't theories, he said. They're tested frameworks. Some have already been piloted in states like California and New Jersey. We've taken what works, we've built on it, and we've created a model that can scale nationally. He didn't look at Rosie. He didn't need to, because this moment wasn't about her anymore. This was about the audience, the viewers, the voters, the young people watching who had been told politics was too complicated for them. The returning citizens who'd been treated like numbers instead of names. The communities who'd waited too long for someone to speak not for them, but with them. Denzel didn't just know the problem, he'd become part of the solution. And for the first time that morning, Rosie O'Donnell said nothing, not because she wasn't allowed, because she didn't have anything left to say. The smirk was gone, the leaning back in her chair had stopped. Her fingers tapped the edge of the table now, almost absently. She glanced at the packet in Denzel's hands, the weight of it, the content of it, realizing maybe for the first time that this wasn't a performance. This was policy. Denzel took a breath, not from exhaustion, from patience. Now, he said calmly, if you say you understand this better than I do, go ahead. He pushed the folder slightly toward the center of the table. Cite your sources. A pause. I'll wait. The audience didn't cheer, they inhaled, because the moment didn't need volume, it needed truth. And truth, when it lands without resistance, is deafening. Rosie looked down, her hands stilled. She wasn't silenced, she was outmatched. And everyone watching knew it. Denzel folded the folder closed, not like a mic drop, but like a teacher ending a lesson. And when he looked up again, he didn't smile. He simply nodded once, the way a man does when the work is done. When the proof is in the policy, when you no longer have to fight for a seat at the table because you brought the table with you, the clip didn't just go viral, it detonated. Within minutes of the broadcast, social media caught fire. First came the shocked reactions, short, stunned tweets with nothing but ellipses and capital letters. Then came the hashtags. Washington surged to the #1 trending spot on Twitter in under 30 minutes. On TikTok, users remixed Denzel's calm stare into dramatic slow-motion edits set to orchestral music. His line, "Cite your sources, I'll wait," was stitched into audio memes, parody debates, and even a gospel remix that racked up millions of views before the afternoon was over. But this wasn't just viral for the sake of spectacle. This was different. It wasn't a clapback. It was a correction, a course realignment, a cultural reset wrapped in composure. CNN opened its primetime slot with a side-by-side breakdown of the exchange. The headline read, "Denzel did not react, he responded." Fox News, often miles apart politically, aired the clip on 2 separate shows with anchors praising his discipline and depth. One conservative commentator, who disagreed with Denzel on almost everything else, said simply, "This wasn't political, it was surgical." The Washington Post ran a full editorial under the title, "The Anatomy of Composure." When truth does yell, it dissected the moment not as a debate, but as a masterclass in controlled authority. Harvard law professors began sharing the video with students. Advocacy groups used it as an example of how to withstand personal attack with integrity intact. Communication experts praised Denzel's pacing, his precision, his refusal to take the bait. And Rosie unraveled. At first, she tried to stay silent. Then, 24 hours after the broadcast, she tweeted, "Respect to Mr. Washington, sometimes passion takes over. Good conversation, though." The replies were brutal. One user replied, "Passion didn't take over, ego did, and it got steamrolled by grace." Another posted a screenshot of a 2007 clip where Rosie had stormed off the View mid-debate after being challenged by a co-host. The caption read, "Pattern." Someone else dug up a tweet from Rosie claiming the Constitution was written in 1796. The correct year, of course, is 1787. Underneath, a simple comment. "Maybe cite your sources." Within hours, her tweet was ratioed into oblivion. By nightfall, it was deleted. But screenshots, as always, were forever. What made the backlash even harder for Rosie was how quiet it was. No massive outrage campaign, no cancel mobs, just a slow, deliberate exhale from the public, a collective decision that said, "We've seen this act before, and we're done pretending it's brave." The story wasn't about her anymore. It was about him, because something had shifted. You could feel it. Suddenly, the line between talking loud and saying something meant something again. Viewers started noticing the difference between people who filled airtime and those who filled the silence with substance. The clip became a litmus test, a moment of clarity. It reminded everyone that not all voices are equal when truth is on the line. Producers behind The View were caught flat-footed. They issued a carefully worded statement about valuing respectful dialogue and appreciated Mr. Washington's contribution to the conversation. Internally, however, sources confirmed that Rosie's scheduled return for future episodes was quietly pulled from the calendar. In the meantime, Denzel stayed exactly where he was, calm, composed, unmoved. He didn't post a victory thread. He didn't go on a press tour. He simply thanked the remaining co-hosts for their time and continued the conversation, as if he hadn't just delivered one of the most elegant demolitions in daytime television history. Later that week, when asked by a journalist how he felt about the internet's reaction, Denzel just smiled and said, "I came to talk policy. That's what I did." It was more than humility, it was discipline. The kind that doesn't get shaken by praise because it was never seeking applause in the first place. What followed was a ripple effect that extended far beyond that studio. Teachers began using the clip in classrooms, not just for its civics content, but for its example of presence under pressure. Panelists across networks started approaching debates differently, slower, more thoughtful, less combative, less performative. Even the language began to shift. "You're getting Washingtoned" became shorthand in political spaces for being outmatched not by volume, but by preparation. It didn't mean being humiliated. It meant being exposed. And for many, it served as a warning: do your homework or sit down. The cultural impact of that moment wasn't just viral, it was corrective. It reminded people that being loud isn't a credential. That eloquence isn't elitism. That conviction, when grounded in experience and clarity, doesn't need to shout. Rosie faded from the headlines. Her next few public appearances were subdued. No hot takes, no interruptions. Just shorter interviews, tighter smiles, and a palpable sense that the rules of engagement had changed, and not in her favor. Because in the end, this wasn't about a clash of personalities. It was about a clash of standards. And Denzel Washington didn't just meet the moment, he raised it. In the weeks that followed, the moment stopped being just a moment. It became a marker, a point in time that people looked back on and said, that was the shift. That was the day the performance lost and preparation won. The clip of Denzel Washington dismantling arrogance without raising his voice didn't just circulate, it embedded itself into classrooms, into boardrooms, into the cultural bloodstream. At Harvard Law School, the exchange was officially added to the curriculum under a new module titled Poise Under Fire. Professors dissected not only Denzel's argument, but his composure, his restraint, his surgical use of silence. At Fordham University, his alma mater, the administration announced the creation of a new scholarship, the Denzel Washington Justice Fellowship. It would be awarded to first-generation law students of color who demonstrated both academic excellence and a commitment to public service. The announcement came with a single sentence from the university president: because integrity should echo louder than applause. Meanwhile, the phrase began spreading offline. You got Washingtoned. It wasn't said with cruelty, it was said with clarity. A shorthand for being humbled not by insult, but by insight, for thinking you had the upper hand in a conversation only to discover the other person had done the work. It became part caution, part compliment. A reminder that loudness isn't the same as depth. Rosie O'Donnell quietly stepped back from the spotlight. For 6 months, she turned down guest spots. Her team issued no statements. There were no follow-up interviews. Only a brief appearance at a closed-door media ethics conference where she participated in a panel titled When Ego Overpowers Dialogue. According to those in attendance, she spoke little, but the story had moved on. Denzel Washington wasn't trending anymore. He was transforming. Requests flooded in, from universities, from legal panels, from bipartisan coalitions looking for a speaker who could speak to policy without losing the human soul behind it, from students who had never seen someone like them command a room not through noise, but through knowledge. 6 months after the broadcast, Denzel stood at a podium in the Capitol Rotunda, not to accept an award, not to promote a film, but to deliver the keynote address during a congressional session on criminal justice reform. The chamber was full. Members of both parties sat in silence as he spoke, not as a performer, but as a peer. He didn't give a speech. He gave a statement. To those who once questioned whether I understood justice, he said, pausing to scan the room, I hope this vote brings clarity. Applause followed, not thunderous, but steady, respectful from left, from right. From places that rarely agreed on anything except this, excellence had spoken. Outside, the world kept moving, but something beneath it had shifted. In classrooms, debate teams began quoting Denzel's exchange as a reference point for dignity under pressure. In editorial rooms, producers reconsidered which guests they paired for confrontation. And in communities often left out of these conversations altogether, young people saw something they hadn't seen in a while: a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself with volume. The kind that walks into a room already carrying the receipts. The kind that doesn't flinch when underestimated, because it's already done the work. The confrontation between Rosie O'Donnell and Denzel Washington was never just about two people on a stage. It was about the story so many people live through quietly, being spoken over, being dismissed, being told you're passionate but not qualified. And for once, on a national stage, the story ended differently. Denzel didn't win because he fought harder. He won because he prepared deeper. He didn't shout her down. He showed up ready. And when the moment came, he didn't burn the house down. He built a better one and invited the audience inside.